So, moving forward, we're welcoming Sourcemap to the stage now. Joining us today is Marissa Brock. It's Senior Director of Policy and Government Affairs. Sourcemap is a pioneer of supply chain transparency and traceability software that span out of MIT research started in 2008. Since then, major traders, manufacturers, and brands have adopted Sourcemap's full suite solution for assurance on the raw materials to finished goods supply chain, including ongoing monitoring for production, quality, sustainability, and risks such as deforestation and forced labour. Please, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the stage Marissa, who's going to be talking today about EUDR and beyond, supply chain transparency for regulatory compliance. Marissa.
Hello, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I have a loud voice, so I need to stand back a little bit from the mic. But thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I represent Sourcemap. We have been around for almost 15 years now, helping companies map their supply chains all the way to the farm, to the associated plot of land, to the mine. And what's evolved over the last couple of years has been supply chain mapping is really an essential tool for regulatory compliance. Before 2021, 2022, the majority of our customers were working with us because they had internal sustainability programs, they had committed to responsible sourcing, either internally or customer-facing goals around responsible sourcing. And those use cases continue with Sourcemap, but what's really evolved has been the need for this type of technology to meet the increasing list of regulatory requirements that actually require supply chain mapping and supply chain due diligence. So we're going to talk a little bit about those today. So this is just a snapshot, and frankly, it is not representative of all of the regulations that require supply chain mapping. This is going to be a very, very challenging next few years for a lot of companies because many companies both based in the EU and that do business in the EU are subject to a lot of regulations that may have overlapping requirements. We're talking today about the EU deforestation regulation, but I'm also going to touch on forced labor regulations like the EU forced labor law, which is going into effect in the next few years, the corporate sustainability due diligence directive, which many companies are already starting to put processes in place to try to prepare for, even though even that is a few years away. The digital product passport, which will really transform supply chain transparency because it will pass that transparency on to consumers via QR codes where you can actually scan and view where the products you're buying are coming from. The substantiating green claims law, which is a really interesting one that will require companies that make green claims about their goods to prove that their products are actually made responsibly, sourced responsibly, and sustainable, and really kind of stand up to the claims that they're making. And then there's a lot more. I won't list through all of them, but the EU batteries regulation, we're getting a lot of questions about that from our customers that are exposed to that regulation. And while that one is sort of cascading in terms of the requirements go into effect over the next several years, what's really a common theme across all of these laws is the need to prepare as soon as possible because the list of requirements is quite long. The reporting requirements can be quite extensive. And companies that have in-house compliance teams, which most of you do at this point, those compliance teams are becoming some of the most essential teams at your organizations because they are responsible for ensuring that your internal processes meet the obligations of these laws, that you're prepared to meet the reporting obligations, and that you have technology in place to collect all of this data because this is really, really challenging to do manually. So I want to talk a little bit about just some sort of key metrics and some best practices that Sourcemap has seen over the last 15 years. We'll start with the number of suppliers. So many of the companies that work with us know who their direct suppliers are, their tier ones, but they don't necessarily know their tier twos, their tier threes, and they certainly don't know where the products are originating from, the farms, the mines, the associated plots of land. We have found that there are between 5 and 25 times more sub-suppliers than direct suppliers. So why does that matter? Let's say that you are importing into the United States. The US has a forced labor regulation on the books that specifically says that goods that are manufactured whole or in part, which is really critical language here, using forced labor are subject to detentions or seizures. The reason that whole or in part language is important is even if you have conducted due diligence on your tier 1s, your tier 2s, and your tier 3s, and you feel like you can say, we know that there's no forced labor for those 3 tiers in our upstream supply chain, but your tier 12 is on a list of banned entities or has been accused of forced labor, and the US government is cross-checking your suppliers against their own internal database of banned entities, your product would still be detained or seized. And the fact that you didn't know that that supplier was in your supply chain does not qualify as an excuse for the US forced labor regulation. So something that's really, really important that I cannot underscore enough here is the need to understand exactly who's in your supply chain has never been more critical. You are exposed to financial and reputational risks. You see this bullet on the far left side. A lot of these regulations have fines for non-compliance. Some of them are very extensive. The deforestation regulation, the fine for non-compliance can be up to 4% of a company's global annual turnover, which can be massive. And furthermore, that fine is not necessarily just imposed on the importer of record. It can be imposed on other operators within the supply chain. So there is the potential for shared liability there. And what's really critical here is some companies are more driven by the reputational risk than the financial risk. Even if you can afford the fines for non-compliance with some of these laws, no one wants to be publicly accused of using forced labor in their supply chain or their products being contributors to deforestation or having high scope 3 emissions, et cetera, et cetera. So the reputational risk can be as much of a driver as the financial risk. The number of documents that companies need to collect can be massive. We work with a lot of large multinational companies. They are doing business all over the world. They are not just importing or exporting into the EU. They're working across regions, across countries. The number of documents that represent not just whether their suppliers are legal entities, so they have a license to operate, for example, but audits and certifications pertaining to their upstream supply chain. Transaction traceability documents, which might include transportation records and payment records for every single product, for every single purchase order. That is a potentially massive amount of documentation. And as I said, this is very difficult to do manually. The number of supply sites for agricultural raw materials, sourcing sites can often number in the tens of thousands. And the complexity of products, we all know this. Even the products that may appear to be the most simple and the most straightforward oftentimes have a lot of suppliers involved in the upstream supply chain. And all of those suppliers are essential components of compliance with these regulations. So I want to talk a little bit about how supply chain mapping works and what Sourcemap's approach is here and how we support our customers. So we are a industry agnostic platform, so we work with companies across industries and sectors. We have customers in apparel, in automotive, in consumer electronics, in life sciences. Really, we span all types of industries and sectors. But what all of those industries have in common is that lack of visibility upstream. And while there are, of course, unique challenges related to those specific industries, there are a lot of commonalities and best practices that you can employ across these sectors. We are a supplier-attested platform. So a customer will come to us with their tier 1s, their direct suppliers. We will onboard their tier 1s into our system. Their tier 1s will disclose who they are sourcing from and the business relationships. And each subsequent tier will disclose their business relationships and their suppliers. So as we collect that information, we're able to build a complete supply chain map that has been attested by your suppliers. This is a different process from an AI-driven model. While there is AI part of Sourcemap's platform, we are not using it to actually map the supply chain. And there are a couple of reasons why we do that. AI-driven platforms are oftentimes not incorporating the time dimension. So what was the nature of the business relationship and when was that business relationship valid. This is really important if you're subject to something like a forced labor regulation and you're using an AI mapping service, and it may show that you worked with a supplier in 2008 that you no longer work with. That information is not helpful for you in 2024. So it is really important to get a complete current map of your supply chain. And as we're collecting these suppliers, this data, we are also able to collect what we call transaction traceability documents. So those are documents related to a specific purchase order where we're collecting and tracing the chain of custody of a good through, as I said, transportation records and payment records. And so we're able to really trace exactly how that good changed hands from the country of origin all the way to the point of import. I want to give you guys a brief case study. There's actually 2 case studies in here, and really show how quickly mapping can be effective for your business and how essential it can be for compliance. So in this case study, a leading apparel company that has a lot of subsidiaries and brands came to Sourcemap with 75 direct suppliers. They're tier 1 suppliers. We registered those suppliers onto our platform and began to cascade upstream to identify the other suppliers in the upstream supply chain and get further upstream to the farm. As we were mapping, we were also running their supplier names against what we call our supplier watch list monitoring, which is actually monitoring supplier names, addresses, known aliases against lists of banned entities. These are oftentimes government lists. For example, the US government has a UFLPA entities list. These are entities that if they are in your supply chain, your product is subject to detention and seizure. But we also pull in government lists out of the EU, Canada, Mexico. We really have a lot of data sources, and our entities list is at this point over 70,000 names. And in this example, this apparel group saw that they had a non-compliant supplier. They saw that one of their suppliers was showing up on one of these lists of banned entities. They were able to identify that issue, remediate it by removing that supplier from their supply chain before they got a detention at import by the US government. So this is really a critical proactive approach to identify potential non-compliance in your supply chain that can lead to detentions, that can lead to financial penalties, reputational risk, et cetera. And within 90 days, we were able to identify 500 sub-suppliers that they did not know they had. So not just as a tool for compliance, this really is effective for just greater visibility into your business. You want to know where your suppliers are based. You want to know if you have critical points of failure in your supply chain. We all went through the lockdowns in 2020 and a lot of supply chains being cut off. You want to know if you have supplier concentration in a particular part of the world and now can prepare for what would happen if those supply lines are cut off. And so this was also useful to this company to gain that greater visibility outside of just the compliance use case. Another case study, in this example, this is an automotive supply chain. Automotive supply chains tend to be fairly opaque. They are difficult to map. There are tens of thousands of suppliers, really, really high numbers of suppliers, and oftentimes difficult to collect information from those suppliers. In this example, 132 suppliers that this automotive company did not know they had were discovered. Their tier 2s, they were able to get an 84% registration rate, so that's 84% of their tier 2 suppliers registered in Sourcemap's platform. They identified who they were sourcing from, and they provided the requisite data that this automotive company was requesting. And the most important stat here is in the first 60 days, 27 raw material suppliers were discovered, so that's going all the way to the farm, to the mine, I should say. And 4 mines were actually mapped as part of this supply chain mapping exercise. So 60 days is really unprecedented scale for the automotive sector in particular, because as I said, this is a particularly challenging sector. But the point here is that this level of visibility is possible. Obviously, it requires effort, it requires investment, but it is possible, and that's really important for those of you that will be subject to these regulations that go into effect in the coming years. I want to turn a little bit towards EUDR. I know that not everyone in the room is subject to the deforestation regulation. Some of you might be. If you're not working in cocoa, coffee, natural rubber, wood, palm oil, soy, beef, and leather, then you are not subject to the deforestation regulation. But if you are, I'm sure you, like me, are anxiously awaiting the results of trilogue negotiations, which just resumed. They're resuming tomorrow. They're currently debating the 12-month delay, so the regulation would go into effect in December 2025. And they're also debating the introduction of the no-risk designation as part of the country risk benchmarking. So those trilogues are resuming tomorrow. But regardless, EUDR has been passed into law. It is happening. The timeline is what is up for debate currently, but it is happening. So companies really need to prepare for the volume of data that's required for the deforestation regulation. This is mapping every forest and every farm used in EU shipments. These can number in the thousands of plots of land per shipment. You also need to be prepared to collect polygons for those farms. That means that you need to be asking your suppliers for those polygons as soon as possible, because something that we have seen with some of our customers that are early adopters and really preparing and getting ahead of EUDR is the likelihood that you will get a polygon that is the wrong format, that is inaccurate, that is based in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. It's not out of the realm of possibility, so it's really important that companies are preparing as soon as possible to see whether their suppliers are actually providing the right information and the right data. There's also the importance of real-time integration with ERPs in order to issue the due diligence statements for every shipment that's entering the EU. The volume of due diligence statements that the average company that's subject to EUDR would require can number in the tens of thousands over a given year. That really is dependent on how often you are placing products on the EU market or making them available on the EU market. But again, for large companies, this is a massive, massive amount of data and a massive amount of due diligence statements. And this is very challenging, if not impossible, to do manually, because the turnaround time between when you might have a polygon, when you would need to monitor for deforestation and assess for deforestation, and then actually generate a due diligence statement, for some companies can be 48 hours, 72 hours. So this is not a manual process for any company that's subject to EUDR. I'll speed through this slide because I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions here, but this is just sort of a list of how Sourcemap can address requirements for EUDR. I'll just quickly run through the list on the left. You have to submit polygons or geolocation data for the associated farms in your supply chain. The polygon data has to be validated for formatting and quality assurance, and then it also needs to be assessed for deforestation. Those assessments should be against the EU's Global Forest Observatory, which we know has a lot of problems, but it should also be run against more robust deforestation data sets because, again, the EU has said they will update their Global Forest Observatory. It is currently not great. So there is a need to make sure that you are cross-checking against other data sets. Then the due diligence statements have to be submitted directly to the EU's deforestation due diligence registry for every single shipment. And then what also needs to be happening in the background is a legality assessment for your suppliers. So part of EUDR, it's not just the ban on deforestation, products made with deforestation from being placed on the EU market. They also want products to be compliant with local and regional laws in the countries of origin. This is obviously complicated because every country has its own laws and might not all be subject to the same standards for things like child labor, forced labor, illegal logging. There's really a whole list of risk categories for legality. So this requires a pretty robust level of due diligence, and a lot of companies are using third-party auditors to do site visits for some of their highest risk suppliers or suppliers where they don't feel like they're getting adequate information. All of this is part of Sourcemap's current functionality. So we've built the ability to cross-check polygons for formatting to make sure they're compliant with EU standards. And then we're able to assess those polygons for deforestation using some of the data sets that I just mentioned. We're automatically doing that polygon analysis, so this is really important with the time component that I just mentioned. For a lot of companies, they're only receiving these polygons with a short turnaround time from when they actually need to generate a due diligence statement. And then we're actually able to generate that due diligence statement with all of the data that we've collected, and we're connected to the EU's Deforestation Due Diligence Registry via API, so we can submit those due diligence statements on behalf of our customers, provided that we are an authorized representative for those customers. And then we're also able to work with customers on the legality component, which, as I said, is complicated and there's quite a lot of steps. But we're able to work with them to identify some of those high-risk areas. And we have a standard legality SAQ that can be deployed to their suppliers that cover the 7 key areas of risk that the Commission has identified as primary risk areas for legality under EUDR. So I'll skip over this slide since we've sort of covered some of this, but this is really just a visual of the 3 different steps for our deforestation assessment. There's the GIS data validation, then there's the deforestation analysis against the EU Forest Observatory, and then supplemental data analysis. As I said, the Global Forest Observatory has its issues. It's yielding a lot of false positives. We've already run some preliminary polygons from our customers against that data set. There are a lot of false positives, so it is imperative that you are looking at supplementary data sets in addition to that data set. So I want to sort of turn back to some of the other regulations that we support our customers with. This is, of course, a very simplified chart. There are a lot of components to these regulations, but this is basically identifying which of these laws require multi-tier supply chain mapping. So for which of these laws do you need to know beyond your tier 1s who you're sourcing from and how they are relevant to your supply chain. And you can see this is quite a long list, and there's a lot more regulations we could have added here. Chain of custody traceability, again, that is the ability to collect those transportation records and payment records. That's not required for every single regulation on this list, but it is a great tool to actually verify whether your supply chain is accurate. You can map, and that's great, but if you're collecting chain of custody documentation, you can prove the veracity of your supply chain as it pertains to specific purchase orders and specific products. And then various risk assessments. A lot of these regulations are focused on social and environmental risks, and there are overlapping requirements for pretty much all of these. So the burden of due diligence can be quite steep. But if you really understand these laws and have a compliance team that's able to help you identify the overlaps between those laws, you can see that there are some efficient ways to meet the requirements of all of these regulations. So what's next? 2025 and beyond is going to be very interesting for all of us who closely follow supply chain due diligence regulations. We're already seeing increased collaboration between governments on supply chain due diligence. We know that the US and the European Union have had conversations about standardizing supply chain data that arrives at customs. The problem they're trying to solve for is large multinationals essentially have different due diligence processes for their goods that enter the United States and their goods that go elsewhere. They're trying to sort of tamp down on that as a problem and standardize some of that data collection. The overlapping regulatory requirements that I just mentioned, there's a high volume of data collection, and for a lot of companies that don't have partners like Sourcemap or internal compliance and legal teams that are really understanding the intricacies of these laws, it may be difficult to consolidate these overlapping requirements and identify where you can collect this data in a more efficient manner. Reporting directly to customs is going to become standard. So rather than separately creating reports and publishing them, there will be more opportunities to report directly to customs, and the first example of that is the deforestation regulation. Proactive due diligence for all goods placed on the market will become commonplace. This is something, again, to bring it back to EUDR, that is a fundamental change between the deforestation regulation and, for example, the US forced labor law, which requires companies to contest a detention or seizure, but they're not collecting that information. They should be, but they're not necessarily collecting that information before the detention or seizure has occurred. And then those steeper penalties for non-compliance. This is a big motivator for companies, but the reputational risk is just as much of a motivator. So we're seeing a lot of really interesting updates coming in the next few years. For me, since I work in government affairs, I find these updates very exciting, but it's a lot to comb through, it's a lot to understand, and your compliance teams have never been more essential to the success of your business. So it's really important that they understand the intricacies of these requirements, they understand how to make sure your business is compliant and is minimizing its potential risk exposure. So reach out to me to learn more. We have a booth in the other room, and my colleagues are here as well. So if you have any questions, we're happy to answer some questions now, but if you have any questions you'd like to ask us privately, we have a booth at the back end of the hall across the lobby here. So thank you very much, everyone. Okay. Yes.
Thank you very much. It was a really impressive presentation. I have two questions. So question number one is when you do the sourcing, the map for the sources, do you do it based on specific materials? Because this might be very complicated
Yes.
if we share the anti-supplier base and then you have to do the tier N analysis. Question number one. And question number two is, how do you make sure that if we disclose our suppliers, also our sub-suppliers are disclosing their sources as well? I think this is also very complicated.
Yes. Great question. So I'll answer your first question. We're actually creating the map of your suppliers before we are tracing from a purchase order. So both of those things are happening not necessarily in parallel, but essentially the first step is mapping your end-to-end supply chain. Your static supply chain, and then step two will be mapping from a purchase order that chain of custody. So we're essentially doing both of what you just described. We're mapping your suppliers, but then we're also tracing an actual product, which, as you said, is the more complicated part of the supply chain mapping exercise. But it's important to know all of your suppliers as well, not just the suppliers that are related to a specific purchase order that you may be worried about. And your second question around how do we ensure that sub-suppliers are responding. So Sourcemap has an in-house supplier engagement team that's based in our Paris office. They speak between 8 and 10 languages, I think is the last official count. So anytime a supplier is unresponsive or providing inaccurate information or not the right information that our customer is asking for, we have a live team that's able to reach out in the native languages of the suppliers to not just push them to respond appropriately, but also to explain why this information is being requested. I think one of our previous speakers mentioned this, that if your suppliers have no idea why you're asking for a particular piece of information, they may be suspicious, they may just think, well, this is something I can ignore. They're not necessarily aware of the deforestation regulation or the US forced labor ban or the EU forced labor regulation. They don't necessarily know why you're asking for this info and are more likely to ignore it if they don't have that context. So that's really what our supplier engagement team is there to do, to make sure that we're able to increase the supplier response rate in their native language and really explain why this information is being requested. Thank you for the question. Oh, great. Anyone else?
So how do you keep all this information alive, right? So
Yeah.
at the same time that we are approving new suppliers, all the different tiers are also approving new suppliers, right? So I also have two questions. One is, how do you keep this alive? And your source is from whatever the supplier tells you?
Yeah.
Or do you take the information directly from their systems?
Yeah, great question. So in terms of how we keep this information alive, our platform is constantly being updated. So this isn't a one-time endeavor with a customer where they're just providing all of the information in, let's say, 6 weeks, and then we never go back and map For most of you, your supply chains are constantly changing, so information that might have been relevant 2 months ago could be completely irrelevant moving forward. So we're constantly collecting this information and reissuing those requests for information to suppliers to make sure the supply chain map is up to date. And our customers have access to a complete dashboard, so they're not only seeing the map and the network diagram of not just every single supplier, but how they work together and fit into that diagram, but they're also able to track specific key performance indicators that are some standard in Sourcemap's platform, and some have been identified by a customer that they want to prioritize X, Y, and Z, and so we've built a custom dashboard for them. I believe you had a second question. Oh, the source, yes. Yes, good question. So we're supplier tested in that we are collecting information directly from a supplier, but a lot of our companies that we work with have ERP systems. They have other internal monitoring systems that we're able to integrate. So if they've already done the work to map a number of tiers, we're able to pull that information in. We aren't forcing them to recollect all of that info if they already have, you know, their tier 1s, their tier 2s, and their tier 3s. So they are able to integrate that into the system, and then we go from there and collect the additional data. Great. Well, if anyone has any other questions, as I said, we're at the booth in the other room, so if you'd like to come up and chat with myself and a member of my team, please feel free to do so. Thanks, everyone.